Okay, so yeah, as Mark mentioned, I've been in the club six plus years now, and I don't think we've ever done a tube fly. Tube flies are something that I got really interested in fishing in Vancouver a few years back. All the fly shops up there are just packed full of tube flies. It's a really popular style of fly fishing up there with the spey rods. The pattern we're going to be doing doesn't mimic, isn't an exact copy of any pattern I've ever seen. It's kind of something that I just adapted for the materials I have, and my daughter picked out the colors. She thought it looked great, but it's very similar to some of the patterns they have up there for bull trout. It's a relatively small tube fly. A lot of the tube flies they tie up there are for steelhead, and they'll typically be intruder styles. So 2.5, 3 inches long, usually with a back tail on it. Pretty big, but pretty sparse. Sometimes tandems. So they'll tie 2 tube flies and they'll put them back to back and kind of give it a tandem action up there. And I went fishing for 2 days up there, and all we used was tube flies. So it's pretty common. So we'll go over the materials tonight. So as I mentioned, this is going to be more of a trout tube. So we'll be tying on what HMH calls, I think, micro tubing. But essentially it's Bowden or medical grade rigid tubing. So it's about 40 mils inner diameter and about double that outer diameter. That's what you actually tie the fly onto. We'll also need what they call flexible tubing. And this is actually what you use to capture the hook on the back of the tube. And what else here? What other materials are we going to have? So maybe I should show the fly, huh? So this is what it actually looks like. Essentially, you've got a French tinsel hotspot on the back. You've got an ostrich hurl, kind of very, this is very salmon fly-esque. I'm actually a huge fan of salmon flies, but I'm too cheap to actually fish with them. So this is almost a poor man's salmon fly. You have a diamond braid body, and then the French tinsel wraps it, captures it, and then you've got a fire orange schlappen, and then a ice dub peacock black bump, followed by some more black schlappen and a tube fly bead head. Now it's important that you get a tube fly bead head because the inner diameter of the outer diameter of this tubing is just slightly too big for a normal sized cone that you would want to put on this thing. And this is again in orange also. So those of you that haven't, oh, by the way, I'm using an HMH tube fly adapter. So this is an HMH vise, but the adapter you can put in any vise. They're fairly affordable, about 25 bucks. And this worked out great for me. You can buy the kit. It actually comes with some tubing and some starter materials, so you can get going right out of the box. So I'll show you how I get going on this. Where's my light? You guys see that? So I've got the tube on the mandrel that comes with the adapter. This mandrel is for the 40 mil inner diameter. This kit happens to come with 2 mandrels for bigger tubing, which is 60 mils inner diameter. I almost never use that. I think it makes the fly look really bulky. If I want the fly to look bulky, I figure I'll just put more material on it. I can see instances where you might want to use the bigger tubing, perhaps when you're using thicker tippet, and you need to be able to slip the knot for your loop knot back through the tubing. But again, I never use it. Also, they make copper tubing, steel, brass tubes, so you can get some weight on this thing. But again, I never use it too. I put lead if I want some weight on it. And in fact, the cone heads we're using tonight are not weighted at all. So to get going, you can do this a couple different ways. But I actually like to take my whole piece of tubing, or a reasonable amount of tubing, and I stick the whole thing in there. I don't need to cut it to length yet, so it kind of maximizes my usage of my tubing here. But what I do want is, for consistency, I want to have about 1.5 inches from the tip of my tubing to my eye screw here. So then you can just tighten that down. A lot of people do this different ways. You can actually just put the tubing to the edge of the adapter here, and then use the L shape of the mandrel here to actually push it into the edge of the adapter. I don't think that works as well. The tubing tends to spin when you do that. And also, as you might have guessed from looking at the fly, you see that the head of the fly there? The head of the fly actually has burnt tubing. And if you have your L, well, you're going to have to take it apart also, but if you have your L all the way against the tubing, you're going to be melting the plastic into the mandrel. So, okay, for thread tonight, I'm using 8/0 uni black. And I'm going to begin by just starting maybe a cone heads away from the edge of the tubing and wrapping all the way back. So I do think it's pretty important that you get a good base for your thread here, because things can twist on you. Look at that. I broke my thread. So while I'm putting my thread back on, a couple reasons why you would use a tube as opposed to a long shank hook that it would mimic. The hook, talk about the hooks real quick while I'm doing this. Hooks.
Kyle?
Yeah.
Could you pull your jacket off? The black and white is a little
Oh,
distracting.
telling you? Yeah, sorry. You've been trying to get my jacket off. So the hooks I typically use for these are short octopus hooks. Size 4, 6, 2, 8, you can choose. So long as the head fits in that flexible tubing, you can pretty much use whatever size you want, which is an added benefit. But a reason why these are a little bit more beneficial for your hookup or keeping the fish on is because you don't have the big lever action of the long shank. So when this thing is in the flexible tubing, the hook can move, but the fly will bend. And likewise, the guys up in British Columbia actually think that the guides especially thinks it saves their flies, their guide flies. Typically, especially steelhead, when they bite from the back, they'll take the hook and the tube fly kind of runs up the tippet and it's out of their mouth and gets, well, doesn't get ruined. Okay, so I got my thread back. See if I can salvage this. Okay. Okay, so I've returned the thread near the head. And now what I'm going to tie on is the French tinsel in a medium. Say about 6 inches. I'm going to tie that on the inside towards me. Take that tinsel all the way back to your adapter. Okay. Then return the thread back to about where you're gonna have your hotspot end. So typically I like to put about 4 or 5 wraps away from me of the tinsel on to make a nice hotspot. You want these nice, tight, touching wraps. Okay, when you got your hotspot on, lock it down. And then actually, I want to take it forward, maybe 1/8 of an inch. Go ahead and give that a nice thread base. So the next thing we put on is some ostrich turtle. I think 1 is sufficient. Some people use 2 or 3. I don't think it really, I think less is more on this fly. It just kind of gives it a nice attractive, brings your eye to the hot spot. Tie that in at the base. And bring your thread forward a little bit. Okay. And then we're trying to wrap this so we get that nice cone looking effect that you see on a lot of salmon flies. Again, poor man's salmon fly. Keep your tinsel out of the way. Okay. Let's say what I do there, about 4 or 5 wraps. Okay. Now what I typically do here is I'll use my material holder and pull the tinsel back and capture it, because as you can see, it gets annoying. And the next material we're going to put on should make use of my other camera here. Next thing we're putting on is the flat diamond braid black. It's actually not quite flat black. It's kind of like a peacock black. You're going to need about 6 inches of that. Go ahead and bring your thread all the way up. Tie that on the inside. I like to pull on the diamond braid. It makes it a thinner profile, and I think hides the back wrap a little better. And you want to tie that all the way up to the herl. And then you want to bring your thread back to about, well, I don't know, 1/4 of an inch from where you first tied in. So now we're going to take the diamond braid and wrap away from you, pulling on the diamond braid to make it a little tight to the tubing. Not too tight, because diamond braid will start to fray. And lock it down. Okay. And you are done with the diamond braid. You can cut that off. Now you take the tinsel that you had been hiding away, and you give the ribbing. It's not really locking anything down per se, so you can still wrap away from yourself. Okay, so you've got a nice ribbed body now. So next thing we need to tie in is the schlappen, my favorite material word. So we've got orange. You can use any color you like. Well, you can use anything you like, because I made the fly up. Why can't you? And then we're going to use orange for the middle. And we're also going to use black for at the head. So both of these are about 5 to 7 inches. So take the orange. You're looking for a piece with good length on the barbs. So what you're looking for is after you pull back the fluff, you stretch out your barbs a little bit here. You want the length to be such that your feather gets to about the eye right there. That'd be a good length. So get rid of all the fluff. You don't want any of the fluff. If you keep fluff on it, it's just going to lay down once in the water. The point of this guy is to have a lot of action in the water. Tie it in at a 45. So strip it back so you give yourself a little bit of stem there. I like to bring the thread forward a little bit. I think it helps if you fluff it out to begin with. And every time you turn here, I want to keep stroking it back. You're just going over it, maybe advancing a little bit. And I usually go until I think I've got enough body, I guess is the right word. Don't worry if it's not completely perfect. We're gonna fix it. So at this point, I like to, well, in COVID, I shouldn't be doing this, but I like to wet my fingers, stroke it back a little bit, and wrap it back upon itself so that it lays down just a little bit. You don't want it laying down too much. And also you want to make sure you've got it pretty uniform around there before you wrap it back, or else you've captured those pieces of the feather that are stuck to the shank, I guess. And I also like to give a little brush, make sure any pieces aren't getting stuck in there. And maybe wrap it back a little bit more so it lays down a little better than that. Okay. So at this point, I like to put a good thread base here in front of it. So the next part of the fly is the most important part of the fly. Schlapping's pretty stiff, but it's not stiff enough in water to keep itself from sticking to the shank once it's being swung. So what you want to do is we want to create something that kind of keeps the head schlapping from falling onto the shank. So we're going to create a bump. We're going to create a dubbing bump. I like to put wax on my thread, especially if the UV stuff is kind of stiffer than most dubbing. It's not a natural, or the ice dubbing, it's not a natural dubbing, so it doesn't just adhere to the thread very well. Oh, and I'm using, I don't know if you can see it, Ice Dub Peacock Black. Okay, go ahead and make it thick. You want a fairly large bump. Yeah, you know, I think I could put a little bit more than that actually. Can always add more. Hard to take it away. Okay. Okay, so wrap in front of the thread bump, or the, I have some defective thread tonight. Okay, so now it's time for the black splatter. Same thing as the orange. Once you get rid of the fluff, you want it to be about the same length as the orange, because you don't want to obscure the orange, and now you're a 1/4 inch ahead. So you're going to see a nice 1/4 inch portion of the orange behind the black. Okay, tie it in at a 45 again. Don't worry too much about your head. We're going to hide it with the cone. Same thing, keep stroking this back. This one I think I tend to advance a little bit more because I'm going to try to clean it up a little bit for the cone to fit on nice. Okay, I think that's pretty good. Okay, wet your fingers, stroke it back a little bit. Not as important that you tie it back, but I think it looks nice. Okay. So at this point, you've pretty much tied the fly. So go ahead and whip finish. I have left my mandrel out a little too long. Okay. Okay. So at this point, you'd have a perfectly fine working tube fly, but I tend to put a cone head on almost all my tube flies just because I think it really adds that extra touch that makes it look pretty snappy. Also, at this point, I like to brush it out. Once you put the cone head on, you're going to kind of lock in, for the most part, the look of where those all lie. Okay. So I think I mentioned that these are not normal cone heads. They are indeed have a bigger diameter. They're brass, unweighted. They tend to be fairly expensive in the fly shop, but but you can get them on eBay for hundreds for a few bucks. So that's also true for the tubing too. The tubing in the stores tend to be very expensive, but it turns out this tubing, both the flexible and the rigid, are used extensively in 3D printers and in medical pneumatics. So there's a lot of it out there. You can buy rolls of it if you want. This pack that I have of the micro tubing, I think cost me $3, maybe less. You just have to be willing to wait 30 days for it to come over on a boat from Hong Kong. Okay, so at this point, you want to take your tube out of your adapter, and we're going to cut it to size. So I kept the tube long. So at this point, what I want is I want to cut so that I have maybe 1/8 of an inch of tubing on the back. So that's how much I have sticking out. And the purpose of that little bit there is so you can attach the flexible tubing to the hook retainer. But before we do that, we want to put our cone head on. So put your cone head on your head of the fly. Take your mandrel, put it back through, leaving a little bit. You can almost tell on my mandrel that it's seen some flame. Put your tube back in. Okay, and what I like to do is you don't want too much tube showing. So actually, oh, wrong camera. So I have probably a little less than 1/8 of an inch of tubing showing. That actually might be a little much. If you have too much tubing showing, when you go to flame it, and what we're doing is we're trying to retain the cone head on there. What will happen is the length of time that you need to actually stick the flame on there, you'll burn the paint on the cone head, or make this big disgusting black plastic tip, because the tubing melts, but it eventually burns if you leave the flame on too long. So I'm going to trim that back ever so slightly. Cone back on, put the mandrel back on. Don't worry about how messy your cut is. It'll be hidden. Okay. So we get to play with fire. You don't get to play with fire very often in fly tying. So I like to hold the cone head back with my bodkin. And you want to put flame on it, but don't just do it on one side, because the tubing will blacken on one side and not melt completely on the other. Okay. There you have it. You have a cone head on it. That plastic will set up within 10 seconds. No real worries. Also, make sure you have the mandrel in when you do this. Otherwise, when you melt the head, you won't have a hole for your fly line anymore, or for your tippet rather, and it'll be a wasted effort. So there you have it. That's the entire fly. Now, I think I mentioned when I was trying to recover my thread that you use typically 1x long, like octopus or stinger hooks for rigging this guy up. What's really cool, what makes this a perfect guides fly too, is what they typically do, at least in British Columbia, and I think most people do with tube flies. So what you do is on your tippet, you tie a loop knot. Now I typically use like a double surgeon's knot. Tie a loop. The loop doesn't really matter how long it is, well, how short it is, but it has to be long enough that you can put the hook back through the loop. So we rig this guy up. You simply put the loop of the loop knot through the eye, and then you put the hook through the loop. So kind of like a Palomar knot. Now, of course, if you're out actually fishing, what you would have is you would have a piece of rigid tubing on the back. If you didn't have a hook on, you could thread the loop knot through the center of your tube. Since we've got this hook on already, we'll throw the tippet through the tube. So what you get is you get something that looks like this when you're fishing it. So it's pretty nice. You can pretty much use any hook you like. You can see too how people do tandem. So, you know, maybe you don't put a cone head or anything on your second fly, and you just stick the other head of the fly into the rigid tubing. All of a sudden, you've got a tandem. So we actually did that quite often. Where if you think you're targeting bull trout, we use one tube. If you're using steelhead, put two on. That kind of thing. And again, say a fish hits, fish is going to take the hook and your fly just kind of goes up the line. So I think that's all I have.